Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to our Entuity Tech Talk on the fundamentals of integrating BMC TrueSight and Entuity. Today we're going to talk about the advantages of this integration and how sharing data can make a big difference in managing your network and applications performance. I'm John Diamond, and I'm a Principal Solutions Architect at Entuity. And also with me today is my colleague, Larry Balon, who's a Field Systems Engineer, and we'll be your hosts for the next 30 or 40 minutes or so. Tech Talks, as most of you know, are designed for our customers and technical members of our authorized partner community. They're recorded and are available on demand from the Entuity YouTube Center. They're a good resource for learning more about the product or reviewing features you may be interested in implementing. Just a few housekeeping items before we get into today's content. We've put the call on mute mode to eliminate any outside noise. However, feel free to ask questions at any time via the chat panel. We'll have time at the end to take questions that have been posted to this chat panel. So let's get started. Larry, let's have the next slide. Today we are talking specifically about the Entuity E16 product. That's the latest production version of the package. This slide shows some of the enhancements of the last two revisions of Entuity Network Management to give you a quick idea of what has been developed to keep our product current. As you can see, at each release there are a multitude of enhancements and newly introduced features. So it definitely benefits you to stay as up to date as you can as new releases come out. Now, Larry, if you could pass control to me, I'd like to talk a little bit about events and incidents, which are at the heart of the topic that we're going to be discussing today. Within Entuity, you've got the concept of real-time events. These events are generated from a multitude of different sources, and they fall into various categories, including system events. Some events are based on SNMP polling. In fact, the majority of the events are. As information is being polled, it's checked to see whether or not there's anything in it that users could benefit from knowing about. There's trap-based events. Syslog messages can be turned into events. When you customize the polling for your own purposes, you can generate events from those custom definitions. And various other types of event all come together in a normalized form and are processed in part of the system referred to as the Event Management System, or EMS. These events, each one tells you that something has happened. It tells you when it happened, the component that it happened to, the type of thing that had happened, details about it, the severity of it, but it doesn't tell you whether or not that is still an issue right now. There is no concept of state within an event. So it's a one-off happening at some point in history. We do have a second concept. We call it an incident. And the job of an incident is to maintain state. Incidents can be opened and closed under the control of events. And so that there is a direct relationship between events and incidents. However, you can have more than one event possible to open up an incident, and there are various other things, including reopening and updating of incidents, and also the concept of expiring an incident, which is where, if, for instance, you have something that happens and then it goes away, if it then happens again within a short length of time, really it's probably a continuation of that previous situation. So rather than opening up a brand new incident, we leave an incident in a closed state for a while before expiring it. And if an incident is then reopened before it has expired, it is assumed to be a continuation of what was going on before. That's an important concept. However, these incidents, every time they change state, whether it's opened, closed, reopened, or expired, every time they change state, something called a trigger can be operated. I'm going to go and take a look at the definition of one of these incidents. I'm going to show you a device reboot incident. So I've selected it. I'm going to the edit. And this says that this type of incident can be raised by any of the following three events. There are three different types of event associated with detecting device reboots. Doesn't matter whether it's a cold reboot, a warm reboot, or a reboot that's been detected because the clock was seen to go backwards. Any which way the device has rebooted, so it doesn't matter which of these came in, it's going to raise the same device reboot incident. You'll be able to see which event caused the incident to be raised, but the same incident will be raised depending on no matter which of those three incidents happen. You'll also notice that there is no such thing as an unreboot. That concept just doesn't exist. So we've got a 300-second or 5-minute timeout. So after 5 seconds, the incident will be closed. If it doesn't happen again within a day, and that's 86400 seconds is a day, then it will expire. That means that if you then get another reboot a few days later, it will raise a brand new incident. If, however, another reboot happens within a day of the previous one, it will reopen that previous incident, as it's likely to be an ongoing situation rather than something brand new. There's this concept of a trigger associated with an incident. And this is fundamental to what Larry is going to tell you about in a few minutes. The idea of a trigger is that it allows you to fire off what's called an action. In fact, you can fire off more than one action if you want. This is something that will happen if an incident changes state. By default, this will only happen when the incident is first opened. If you leave this on transition 2 setting at the default state, then this action will take place if the incident is first opened. If it is closed and then reopened before expiring, you won't see this action take place because you're only asking for it to happen when it's first opened. Incidentally, you can also put one or more conditions in here so that you can have it only happening under certain circumstances. If, however, you call down this menu, you can see that you've got a variety of other options. And the one that Larry's going to be focusing on is any change. So it doesn't matter what change of state happens on an incident, it will cause the action to be implemented. That is the key to the integration technique that he's going to be taking you through. So with that said, I think it's time for Larry to give you the full details of what this integration with BMC TrueSight is all about. Larry, I'm going to pass control back to you.
Thank you, JD. Okay, I've got it. Okay, so we're going to, the agenda for the demonstration portion of today's Tech Talk, I have 6 topics that I want to touch on very quickly on each of them. I'm going to have an overview of the integration, which I'll show in a moment, how to configure the integration, and that would be configuring the integration from the Entuity server side, how to test the connection once you've configured the integration, and then actually configuring the incident trigger through the web UI, verifying operation of the integration, and then finally configuring multiple forwarding instances in the case that you need to forward to more than one TrueSight server. So I'm going to bring up I have one slide to show. This just shows how we're connected between the Entuity server and the TrueSight server. And there may be people in the audience who are using BPPM 9.6 or earlier. We do integrate with that, and Although I'll talk about TrueSight throughout the integration, anything I'm talking about during today's session applies to BPPM servers as well. So this is a very simple block diagram that shows the connection between the Entuity server and the TrueSight server. A prerequisite for the TrueSight server is that IWS needs to be installed. That is the component we integrate with, which is the web services component. And we normally connect between our server to the TrueSight server on port 9080. Alternatively, you can set the port to 9443 if you want to encrypt the traffic. If you're in a multi-server environment, then all of the Entuity polling servers will have to have the integration configured from the configure command. On the lower left-hand side of this slide, you'll see the sample configuration that I'm showing. There are 4 pieces of information that are required to configure the integration from the Entuity side, and that's the cell name, the web server host name, the port number, and the web service name. I'm actually going to now share out my desktop, and we'll go through the configuration. So we'll start with the configure command. So this is where the integration gets configured on the Entuity server side. So when you first configure the server, and this server is going to squawk at me because I already have a 16.0 server running. The integration configuration is the same even for earlier releases of software. So I'm just going to go next through these first few configuration screens. And I'll get to the module selection panel. For customers who have had Entuity for a while, you used to have to come into here and check off a box in the configuration for the module selection to enable that integration. That's no longer the case. The integration is now part of the standard software distribution. What we do is we provide you a page here to enter the information for the integration. So what's required here? We've already pre-populated 2 of the fields. The web services port number defaults to 9080, and again, the alternative port number is 9443 for encrypted traffic, and the web service name is Impact Manager. You should never need to change this last entry in the field. The cell name would be the configured cell name. That's something you need to do on the TrueSight server. That's beyond the scope of today's demo. And then we need to provide the web server host name. That is the server that IWS is running on, and that has to either be the IP address or the host name. I'm going to cancel out of this, and I'm going to go to my active Entuity configuration. There's one other file, which is called the Entuity.cfg file, which I'll bring up here, and I'm going to scroll down to the section labeled BEM, which is BMC Event Manager. That's the old nomenclature. But you'll see here there's a connection username that has to be used. Most customers are going to be integrated with LDAP, and the username we usually recommend a service account be used. This is a default installation, so it's using the default admin username. The connection will default to the All Objects view. So as I go through how to configure the integration on the Entuity server from the web UI perspective for the incident triggers, you'll see that the All Objects view may not be the most optimal view to use, mainly because you can't apply filters to it. Most customers in practice will create a view for forwarding incidents, and I'll show that in a moment. So once you've configured the integration, what I always recommend is that the integration be tested. So there are 2 ways to test the integration. I'll bring up a command prompt. So we know that the server is listening on port 9080. So the most basic test you can do is to telnet to the IP address of the server on port 9080. When I connect there, I should have a connection. This command prompt should be opened at the Entuity server. If you're running Linux, it'll just be a shell, but the basic concept is the same. I see there's a connection because I didn't get a prompt back. It didn't reject me, so I know the communication path on port 9080 between the Entuity server and the TrueSight server is there. Once I've terminated the connection, the other way to do that is through a well-formed URL, and it will bring up the WIDSL page. So basically what this is going to do, I'm going to hover over this. I'm going to connect to the TrueSight server on port 9080, and then the URL I'm going to call up is after the port number. What this should do is should bring back a page of XML. If you can bring this back, and this should be executed from the Entuity server, you can be pretty confident that both servers are configured properly and that we're able to bring back the XML from the TrueSight server. So once the connection is tested, the next step is to actually configure the incident trigger, and we'll do that from the Entuity Web UI. So I'm going to close this out, go back to the Entuity Web UI, and I'll start from scratch where you would go to the event administration page, and we are forwarding incidents. So what we're going to do is we're going to program or configure a global trigger. I'm going to select the incidents tab. On the lower left-hand page, on the lower left-hand side of the web page is an Edit Global Triggers button. You can see here we don't have any triggers currently configured. So when you're forwarding to a single cell on a TrueSight server, there's two ways that this global trigger can be configured. The most basic way is to assign a name to this. I'm going to call this TrueSight Forwarding Default View. The transition, JD already talked about the different incident states. What we want is any change. That means if the incident's opened, if it's reopened, opened or reopened, or if it closes, we're going to send those state changes to the TrueSight server so it reflects the actual state of the incident. If I put no conditions in, it's going to take the entry from the Entuity.cfg file, which in this case is the All Objects view, and then I have to select an action. So it's very simple. From the pull-down menu, we have an action called Send to BMC Event Manager. There's a parameter that's below this, which is called CNAME, and that's an abbreviation for cell name. If you're forwarding to a single cell, then this needs to be blank. It needs to be kept at the default, which is an open and close quotes. This tells our software to go look for the cell name that's configured when you ran the Entuity configure command. If you're forwarding to a single cell and you modify this parameter, you will break the integration. So we are forwarding to a single cell. I'm going to click OK. I'll click OK again. I click OK. And you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, the project has unsaved changes. So not only do you have to configure the global trigger, you have to deploy the project to activate it. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'll assign a name to the project. And I'll click OK. And now the project's been deployed. If the project's been deployed correctly, you won't see any error messages. You'll see the word message log in the lower left-hand corner of the web page. If there are errors, they'll show up there. What I'm going to do before we go to the TrueSight event console is I'm going to show you the alternative way to configure the integration. So I'll go to the Explorer tool, and you'll see here there are three views: all objects, my network for the administrative user, and my network for the default user of the system. They all have locks on them, which means that they can't be modified. So generally accepted practice for production environments is to create a new view, and I'll call this TrueSight Forwarder View. then on the Contents tab, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select Automatic and populate the view automatically and populate it with objects from the All Objects view. And click OK. And you can see all of the devices show up in this view. So once I've done that, if I go back and edit the view, now I can go to the Incidents tab and I can apply filters to this. This is something I cannot do with the All Objects view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back into the Event Administration tool. I'm going to select Incidents, and I'm going to edit the global triggers. I'm going to add a new trigger. I'll just call this New View. For the transition, again, I'm going to select any change. I'm going to add a condition to this. So I'm going to add a test. And what I'm going to add is a view membership test. And the view that I'm going to select is the one I just created. So once I do this, this test, so the first thing we're going to do for the trigger is test to see whether the device is in the view called TrueSight Forwarder View. Once you add a condition to the trigger, it overrides anything in the Entuity.cfg file for the view name that's being used for forwarding. So now it's going to take the events that show up in this view, and we'll apply the same action, which is to send to BMC Event Manager. The CNAME parameter stays blank. Click OK, and again, we'll deploy the project. And there we go. So once the integration is active, then we can go over to the TrueSight Console, which I've already logged into. And you can see here that we're already receiving incidents from the Entuity server. This middle pane already updated to indicate that we have new incoming incidents. So you configure a cell, which is basically a place to collect all of the network-related events. And what I've done is I focused on the cell named Entuity. So all of the network-related events are going to show up in this cell. What we're seeing here, as far as the columns go, is the most basic information you're going to see when you integrate. So it's when that incident occurred, we map the severity levels, what the message is, and what device that message came from. Then in the object field below, we'll always populate that with an object URI, which is basically a cross-launch URL that will cross-launch directly into the object that generated the incident. So if I click the hyperlink, that's going to launch a session with the Entuity server. I'll log into it. You will have to log in the first time. If you keep logged in, the next time you do the cross-launch, you'll be cross-launched directly into it. So I'll bring this up to full screen, and you'll see that indeed there are two severe incidents associated with this one particular fast Ethernet port, and I can click here, and you'll see this. These are the way that these incidents are populated in our event viewer. But I'll go back, and you can see that the fault and the discard information is here, and if I click here on a graph, that will bring up the fault information. And now you can continue to troubleshoot the problem. I'm going to go back to the TrueSight console. So again, you'll see that there are columns that have information in them. Again, this is the bare minimum that you see with the integration. These columns are called slots within TrueSight. And if I want to add additional columns, I can do that by using the column selector tool, which is this icon right here. I can bring up the editor, and I'll bring up the single columns editor that allows me to add single columns to the display. There's actually a column event class for Entuity. So I'll scroll down to the E's, but it's not labeled Entuity. It's labeled iEvent, which is what the old name of the product was. I can bring up this class of columns, and if I wanted to add, for example, the component ID for that particular that particular piece of information, I just simply drag that here until there's a plus sign, and you can see now the component ID is now shown in that column. And I can add as many columns as I want. If I add columns, enough columns, there'll end up being a scroll bar below here. But the takeaway here is you can customize the information that you see within the TrueSight Event Management Console. So the last thing that I'm going to demonstrate today is how to configure multiple forwarding incidents. So many customers have primary and secondary TrueSight servers, or in other cases, certain customers may want to configure additional cells to receive specific information, and we can tailor that by creating customized views and assigning those to forward to specific cells on a TrueSight server. So this is a bit more complicated than setting up the incident trigger that we set up before. It does require that you go into the Entuity configuration. So within the etc directory of the Entuity server, you'll see there is a file. It's normally named bem-connections-example, so it's not used. The first thing you need to do is rename this, and I've already done that. I've renamed it to the bem-connections.cfg. You bring this file up with a text editor, and then you have individual entries for each connection to either a different cell or a different TrueSight server. The name that's used so it has to be, the heading has to be connection, space, and then the connection name. We put some default values in here. I'm just going to change them to the TrueSight server 1, and the one below that I'm going to set to TrueSight server 2. I'm going to omit the rest of the entries, but you would have to provide a primary cell name, primary web server host name, and then a secondary host name and cell name. Once I do that, I save this. And you'll have to stop and start the Entuity server for this configuration to take place. Then the next thing I need to do is I need to configure the incident triggers. So similar to before, I'm going to go to my Edit Global Triggers. I'm going to add a global trigger. I'll name the trigger forward to TrueSight Server 1. Again, on the transition, the takeaway here, it should always be set for any change. I'm not going to assign a condition from it, but you could assign the view name to forward from, and then I'm going to add an action. It's the same action sent to BMC Event Manager, except now, because you're going to have more than one forwarding incident, you do need to change the CNAME or cell name parameter. So I'm going to set that. It has to be between, these are single quotes, and this is the entry that I put into the bem-connections.cfg file. This has to match that entry exactly, including case. It is case sensitive. I'll click OK. This is my first trigger, and again, I'll add a trigger for the second server. I'll select any change, and then again, I'm going to add an action step where I'll forward to the BMC Event Manager, and I choose the second entry from that table, which is TrueSight Server 2. I click OK, And okay, again, once both of those triggers have been configured, then I deploy the project. Normally you would change the name. For the purposes of today's demo, I'm just going to keep that project name the same. And you can see here, if you make a mistake like I just did, you'll have a big red X in the event administration, and down in the message log section, it will tell me that I have an invalid expression, TrueSight Server 1. So I can already tell from this that I made a typo. So let me go back and edit the global trigger for TrueSight Server 1, and I'm going to edit this action because it actually tells me, and you can see here that there's the typo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this and put that single quote where it needs to be. Click OK, and now we're going to try to redeploy the project. You can keep my fingers crossed. And there we go. Perfect. So this is actually a good exercise because there was a typo in the configuration file, and the error messages at the bottom of the web page directed me to the error of my ways. And with that, we're going to open up the floor for questions.
We have one question, and it is, are professional services required for this integration deployment?
Okay, Pat, I'll take that one. Thank you. The short answer is no. There is some configuration that needs to be done on the TrueSight server. If you are running the TrueSight server, there are 3 different files, the rules, collectors, and classes files. With TrueSight 10, all of that's included. So there's really very little configuration that needs to be done. You do need to install IIWS and configure a cell. So there is some knowledge required on the TrueSight server side. As you can tell from the Entuity side, there's some entries that need to be done when you run the configure utility, and then it's a matter of setting up the global incident triggers. There are log files that are specific for this integration, and we've done a very good job of providing information in those log files to help troubleshoot connections. If there are custom rules that you need to run or conditions that you need to run from the TrueSight server, you may or may not need professional services. It depends on the level of expertise that you may have on your staff in those areas of, for the TrueSight server.
Okay, thank
Anything
you, Larry.
else?
When you displayed the WSDL page, was that from the Entuity server or from the TrueSight server?
No. So the connection, and I'll go back to the PowerPoint slide. I launched the browser off of my laptop, which is actually running the Entuity software. That's where you want to test the connection. If you test the connection from something other than the Entuity server, you're really not testing to see whether there may be firewalls in place. But I executed that from the Entuity server. And again, I have a Windows installation, so I use Internet Explorer. It may be more difficult for Linux installs if there's no browser software installed on the Linux server, but alternatively, you can use Telnet. Anything else?
Yep. When configuring a multi-server group of Entuity servers, would the incident forwarding only need to be configured on the consolidation server?
No, it needs to be configured on each of the individual Entuity polling servers, because the consolidation server, while it does provide a consolidated view of all of your incidents, the incidents are actually being the incidents are being generated as a result of polling being done by the polling servers. So there is a bit more configuration that needs to be done when you're in a multi-server environment.
Okay. And then another question, where is the documentation found that explains how to implement the integration?
Okay. We do have a chapter so all of the documentation is stored on the Entuity server, and it's in PDF format. So there's a user guide and documentation set. It's in the System and Administrator Guide.
Okay.
And oops, oh, you know what? I thought I was sharing it out, but I'm not. Hang on, Pat. So I've brought up the guide, and basically, if you go to the table of contents, it's actually easier if I only bring the offline PDF up. So the chapter numbers will vary depending on your release level, but for 16.0. It's in Chapter 29. So if I go to Chapter 29, there's a chapter on TrueSight Operations Management. It walks you through the configuration process, which is what we covered during today's demo, and then it steps you through how to set up incident forwarding and also how to set up what we did today for multiple servers. So that's all documented in the Administrator's Guide.
Okay. Thanks, Larry. And then a final question. The send to BMC event manager action, is that a Groovy script? And is this documented in the newer versions?
So it is a Groovy script. So let me just bring up the Entuity server. So if you select the Actions tab under Event Administration, you'll see there's an action labeled Send to BMC Event Manager. And if I edit this, you'll see that there's one parameter, which is that CNAME parameter or cell name parameter that you see. And then you'll see here there's a script execution action step. And if I edit this, you'll see that, yes, we do use scripting to forward incidents. In normal environments, you're not going to need to modify this. But there may be cases where you may want to add customized slot information to the event management console, and it may not be information that we send using this default script. In those cases, it's probably best if you contact BMC support, and then they'll get in touch with us and we can help you out with that. It's recommended that you don't modify this script that's part of this default event send to BMC Event Manager action. If you want to change the script, it's best to basically copy this script and put this and configure a new action where you can put this script in here and just paste it in here and assign a different name to it. You don't want to. This is the default action that's shipped with the standard Entuity distribution. So if you want to modify the script, it's best to copy and paste it and set up a new action.
All right. I've covered everything.
All right.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Larry. I want to make sure that everyone realizes that they should feel free to use the email address that's on the screen at the moment. That's tech.talks@entuity.com for any questions that you've got relating to this topic or any others on any of the other Tech Talk topics. But we would also very much appreciate your input on what topics you would like us to cover in the future. We want to make sure that these Tech Talks cover topics that you want to hear about, that you've got an interest in. You may have questions, you want to discuss them. Let's hear from you so that we know what's on your mind. Larry, let's take a look at that slide that we've got the quote from EMA. EMA is a well-renowned analyst covering IT and network management. And as they point out here, a very high proportion of enterprises are today benefiting from integrating together their network monitoring and the other aspects of centralized event management. And that now includes security monitoring as well. So all of these disparate disciplines are being fed into central systems such as TrueSight Operations Management. And the integration that Larry demonstrated today is how you would benefit from taking the knowledge of what's happening on the network and adding it into the mix. So you're not left blind as to what's going on from a network standpoint. There's more to the IT world than servers, applications, middleware, databases, and storage. The network is the critical underpinning that glues everything together. So, just to wrap up, we're going to be sending you a video link for today's presentation so that you can use it yourself and share it with your colleagues. If you've got any questions about the BMC TrueSight and Entuity integration, you should definitely be sure to contact your Entuity field systems engineer or use the BMC support center. Just a couple of things to mention before we sign off for today. We are going to be launching the Entuity 16.5 version, the next release. It is jam-packed with interesting and very useful upgrades and new capabilities. I'm sure you're going to get benefit from what we've managed to get into that release. That'll be coming out in early Q4. And I want to make sure that you're aware that we've got an enormous amount of very useful training material available on the Entuity Training Academy site. If you want access to that, please send an email to the address on the screen at the moment. That's Pat's address, patricia.o'hara@entuity.com. So with that, I want to wish you all of the best, and thank you very much for attending.